Hello and welcome to The Home Experience, a podcast about movies you can enjoy from the comfort of your own home. I'm Adam Barnard.
And I'm Jackson Smith.
And today we're going to be discussing Mute. So the title for Mute is especially ironic today because that's exactly how my primary microphone is functioning right now. It's not working. Man. So if I sound any different, it's probably A, because I'm sarcastic and a little irritated, but B, it's because I have to use a new mic. So there's something about this movie that just breeds trouble.
It's fitting, it's fitting. It's like, yeah, it's also kind of fitting too that we're talking about a Netflix movie in the middle of Cannes Film Festival. For those of you who don't know, Netflix and Cannes kind of have a contentious relationship, especially this year when the distribution company threatened to pull out of the festival, and obviously they had a lot of big movies on the lineup. They had Alfonso Cuarón's new movie. They had an unfinished movie by Orson Welles, apparently, that they were going to release at Cannes. So Netflix is in some hot water right now, but as is the festival. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that debate between Cannes saying like, movies should be screened in theaters. Like they demand all their movies to have a theatrical release in France. And Netflix obviously is very against that, and we've talked a little bit in the past about movies versus movies at home versus movies in theaters. But I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see a growing divide between the gold standard of Hollywood filmmaking, which is the studio feature film or the big release feature film with a big talent, and streaming movies, which are produced exclusively, through Netflix. Netflix will fund it and distribute it. Mm-hmm. There used to be a classification for theatrically released feature films. It was the golden standard. All Oscar movies came through the theater. If you wanted to see something good and something that was done and maybe even done by an auteur, like a modern auteur like Scorsese or something, you go to the theater. Mm-hmm. Now that Netflix comes around, good content can be produced entirely in this insular streaming service / production company. And that creates problems for classifications, like what movies can win an Oscar. Like, to qualify for the Oscars, you have to have 2 weeks and your movie has to be in theaters for 2 weeks. Even Spielberg weighed in on it and said he doesn't think that Netflix movies should be allowed that privilege. And it's got me thinking as well, what defines a feature film and why a good feature film or a feature film that's eligible, and why do we need to belittle or bastardize streaming services? Yeah,
I mean, although on the flip side, like Netflix's model of distribution is very singular. Like other streaming services that do distribute movies, like Amazon, for instance, all of the Amazon movies do get a full theatrical release and a theatrical run before they are released on Amazon. So it's like Manchester for the Sea, for instance, I think made something like $60 million in theaters before they released it online. But Netflix is, their whole model is very against that. They want it almost exclusively on Netflix. Like you have to have a Netflix account and you have to be at home watching Netflix to be able to see the movie, with some notable exceptions.
And we both come from the film school world, so we're very familiar with cinephiles and the glory of what is viewed as a theatrical or theater-going experience, where that is just the ultimate expression of film. And I just don't think it changes the quality of what's being made. It shouldn't define the distribution shouldn't define what a film is, especially if higher budget, higher qualities films are finding a way to be produced elsewhere. I don't like, the studio system or the theater chains monopolizing good distribution of content.
I do at least, though, I do at least understand where Cannes is coming from specifically in this. They're a foreign festival and they, based in France, and their qualifications are slightly different from the Oscars. For a movie to screen at Cannes, it has to have a wide release in France, and it also can't be released on streaming platforms until I think something like 4 months after its wide release. Yeah. And so, I mean, Netflix obviously has a problem with that. Like the movies that they have released in theaters, like Mudbound and Okja and some of their more high profile, prestige movies, they got theatrical releases for no other reason than to be eligible for the Academy Awards. And in cases like Mudbound, that obviously paid off. It got nominated for multiple Oscars. But when they do release it in theaters, it's only for 2 weeks. It's the bare minimum. And they also release it on Netflix at the same time, so nobody has any incentive. But film operates very differently in France. They have a different way of looking at movies. They are very focused on the theatrical experience. Yeah, I mean, they've certainly made peace with HBO, like, Fahrenheit 451, the new adaptation of the Ray Bradbury novel starring Michael B. Jordan. That's getting a big premiere at Cannes, and that's an HBO movie. Like, that will not get released in any theaters, stateside, and they certainly had no problem screening that. I think it might just be that Netflix is so abrasive with their tactics. They take so much pride in what they do that it doesn't surprise me that they would be coming into conflict with a festival that values the theater going experience so highly as Cannes does.
I think we're gonna have to start a spin-off podcast called The Theatrical Experience.
The Theatrical Experience.
So we'll do that sometime soon. I think Netflix is at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of prestige, simply because of the amount of original bombs they've had. I mean, the Cloverfield Paradox, produced by J.J. Abrams, was meant to be distributed in theaters. And the crazy thing, there was an ad for it on the Super Bowl, and people thought it was going to start the promotional campaign for their theatrical run. And it literally said, tune in to Netflix tonight to see the Cloverfield Paradox. Like, it was a surprise release that night. I mean, it's brilliant. You just say to 50 million people, there's a movie that you're anticipating that's coming 3 months early, and if you have a Netflix subscription, it's on your computer tonight. However, and so there's a lot of cool things, but that movie did terribly in terms of critics, and Mute did not do well with critics, and Bright did not do well with critics. And I saw one movie fan joke that the new direct-to-DVD derogatory statement is going to be the direct-to-Netflix, because it's like it's starting to feel like the dumping zone of subpar films in some ways. And I think that's only part of what they release, but I think it's going to damage their brand, because if you say, I think there's great original content from Netflix. The TV shows they put out in miniseries are just documentaries. Everything they do is great. They've just seemed to have a real hit or miss with their bigger budget original releases, specifically Mute. I'm very excited to get to talk about this, and we're going to go into the main discussion to find out more about what we thought of the movie and also how the movie fits into the modern cinematic landscape.
I don't deserve you, Leo.
I love you so much, but you don't know me.
Leo, I need to tell you something.
This is gonna stop right now.
Why the hell can't he talk?
He doesn't need words.
You gonna give me some trouble, big boy? Or are you gonna channel that famous Amish serenity?
Mute is written and directed by Duncan Jones and co-written by Michael Robert Johnson. It is available to watch exclusively on Netflix. The story follows Leo, a mute Amish man living in Berlin in the near future who must journey into the dark underbelly of a criminal syndicate to find his missing girlfriend Nadira. So Adam, I just wanna hear right off the bat, what was your knee-jerk reaction to this thing?
Body aches and a fever, but I guess if we're talking about cinematic criticism or proper analysis, holistic analysis, well-intentioned but woefully misguided. This is probably the least favorite film so far that we've covered for me, which is funny because none of the films we've talked about up till now I've actually even liked. Like, I didn't really love. I liked Book of Henry a bit, but I didn't like Last Jedi or this. I think it's such an interesting example of so many things that could have gone right, but so much that went wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it didn't leave a very good taste in your mouth.
No, I mean, I'll be honest, like, it took me a couple tries to get through a rewatch of this. Like, I had to keep pausing it.
Yeah, I remember you saying specifically, like, I'm gonna have to get a new computer because I'm sick of throwing mine at the wall every time every time I try and watch it. I'm gonna be perfectly honest. I kind of dug this thing. I mean, it's flawed, sure, and I will certainly get into what I would change if I were to do a pass on the script or if I were to direct it. But just in terms of a feeling that it left me with, I actually kind of liked it. You know, it's a very moody film. It's got a lot of atmosphere to it. I think the characters are super interesting and detailed and well thought out. And it's one of those movies where I knew after I had finished watching it that I was like, okay, I should feel a more profound satisfaction that I know I'm not feeling, but I kind of want to live more in that world. I kind of want to explore that world a little bit more. I kind of want to dig deeper into those concepts, into those ideas, and few good movies can make me feel like that, quite frankly.
I think you're right about a lot of this. And that's what's interesting. I was expecting to have a very vehement disagreement with you, and I was wondering how we're going to go about this. But I think, again, we agree more than we realize. I just didn't like all the choices. However, it is very clear that a filmmaker with a vision and with a topic and a tone that is close to his heart put himself out there in a project that was going to be very difficult to get made and was very much a passion project. For that reason and that reason alone, I want to give this movie some credit for having a desire to explore and to blend, Blade Runner and a 70s thrillers and modern themes and futurism in terms of the design. I think what he did was actually kind of cool in terms of how he assembled the elements, not in a narrative or structural sense, because that's where it's very flawed, but just in a compilation, in a single world, which is probably why you said, I want to exist in that world beyond the movie.
Spend more time in it. Yeah, I think if you can't fault Duncan Jones, the director, you can't fault him for intentionality.
Sure.
Like this is a very intentional movie. This feels like somebody's hand is on the wheel at all times. Whether you like the turns he's taking and the way he's getting there is obviously up for debate, but he clearly has a destination that he's going to. And yeah, I definitely agree in the sense that his strengths as a filmmaker are a lot more suited to character and mood and world building than they are necessarily to story structure and flow. This is the man who brought us Moon, Source Code, and Warcraft. He's the son of David Bowie, and his work up till now has been, yeah, it's been hit or miss. Like I personally really love Moon. Right. Source Code's a great movie. I kind of hated Warcraft, but even with Warcraft, like there were a lot of things that movie did that were kind of cool. It was just I just didn't care about any of the characters and never felt like I was given any reason to care about any of it.
I'm surprised that this is the same guy who did Source Code and even Warcraft and Moon, because Source Code's storytelling is so precise. I mean, that's what it's like a 90-minute film anyways, and doesn't waste a scene, and he understands character building and structure and tone and suspense and all the cinematic elements you're really looking for in a good director, whether it's an indie director or a blockbuster, a mainstream director. It was a conscious choice to do something different. I mean, this was his passion project. This was intended to be his first film all the way back in the 2000s. It took him, 10, 15 years to get it made, to get the idea made? 10 years, yeah. It's something that I wonder what was going on in his head or what he felt was working that just clearly didn't work for many people, because this movie got like 15% on Rotten Tomatoes and has got a pretty rancid audience response that I don't even think is appreciating some of the few good parts about it. It's just like they're writing it off as this giant loss. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I watched Moon recently again just so it was fresh in my memory, and while there is a lot about Mute that, again, I will confess doesn't work, it does feel like he said, like it's meant to be a spiritual sequel, and it is a literal sequel in some senses. But it felt like it came from the same filmmaker, and it felt like a lot of the decisions were coming from the same place. And largely, I think a lot of those decisions were really good. I mean, like even Moon is one of those movies where I don't necessarily agree with every choice that's made there, or every direction it takes. I just think that movie is a lot more simple and it's a lot more streamlined. Like you're following one guy who's got a very clear goal and a very clear problem. And with this movie, with Mute, you have the potential to do that. You know, Leo is obviously, he's a simple character. You know, he's a well drafted, but he's a simple character. He's got a simple goal. But at the same time, the movie keeps cutting back and forth between this B narrative with Paul Rudd and Justin Theroux as these two surgeons for the mafia that may or may not have some relation to Leo in some way. And while they're very good, and I'll get into that a little bit more later, it is kind of jarring to have these two very dissonant narrative tracks running at the same time. It's not as focused of a movie, if that makes sense.
I just don't understand where it went wrong, because the concept is so interesting. Like I was listening to you recount the story elements, and I'm thinking this is a futuristic cyberpunk neon noir throwback to both the future and the past in terms of old slow burn thrillers. And you have two surgeons for the mafia, which is something that is quite original. I haven't seen very much of that done, or those kinds of characters, that kind of story. Then you have a mute bartender who has a girlfriend who's mysteriously killed. And it's just like, it's such a cool idea. And for me, it just came across so drab. One of my biggest complaints is the first 20 minutes, there is little to no story. Things happen, but I never once care. It's just kind of a day in the life, a slice of life of this mute bartender. And first of all, the fact that he can't speak is already a potential handicap for the storytelling, if you know what I mean. I'm not trying to insult handicap people. I'm talking literally from a
just
cinematic perspective.
Yeah.
You have one less device of expression for your characters, and for your characters, the characters have a restriction, and the writer has a restriction with how they can tell the story.
I actually disagree with you about the beginning. I mean, I agree in the sense that there's not a whole lot of quote unquote artistry to it, but what I think
in the story,
really,
just in the story, not
what I think it does really well is I think the first 20 minutes, especially after seeing it again, I've watched it a couple of times now, and what I think the first 20 minutes does really well is lays out the basic conflict. Like this isn't a movie about his disability. This isn't a movie
I know.
This is not a movie about him being mute. Him being mute is a hurdle that he has to keep dealing with as he goes through this journey of finding her. But the movie is, at its core, a very basic neo-noir mystery. It's this is this guy's girlfriend. This is the kind of stuff she was involved in. These are the circumstances under which she disappeared. And this is what he has to do going forward. Like, that's what the first 20 minutes are. And quite frankly, I thought they did a pretty good job laying everything out.
But let's dig into that, because let's just look at the first 20 minutes. Why do I care? Just because there's a proficiency in traditional narrative structure, or the narrative structure of a certain genre of film that Duncan Jones is very clearly trying to channel, why do I care? That was the other thing. Like, nothing. I had sympathy for Leo, but I didn't have empathy. I come from a religious background that's very restrictive. So when I see that, denying of science or denying surgery, I feel sympathy, but I don't feel engaged. It happens so abruptly. The way it's shot isn't very engaging. I feel like there is this cold expanse between me and the film. A good film surrounds you like a warm liquid, and you just feel like you're floating and basking, or you feel like there's something threatening in the room with you if it's a thriller or a horror. It is this cold detachment. The score is these just repetitive, dull symphonic drones that is a discount version of what they do with Blade Runner, except way more saccharine and way less impactful. Like, seriously, I listen to like beta waves and meditation tracks before I go to sleep. I thought it was one of those. That's how kind of soft and sleepy the soundtrack is. And obviously that's been done in some 70s romance movies or been done. It is a signature type of score. It's just, if you match that with a character who doesn't talk, with a character who you lack empathy for, with a narrative that takes its time, really, even if we have to die on this hill, talk about the first 30 minutes, why do you feel it works and why do I feel it doesn't work? And let's just take a look at these cinematic elements.
Yeah, no, I'm going to cite some specific things, but before I do that, I think it's very interesting because the problem, I didn't care, I lacked empathy, like those were the exact same issues that I had with Warcraft. Like,
really?
Yeah,
no
funny
way.
enough, like that. And I know we're not doing a podcast on Warcraft, but it was my big problem with that movie was I feel like it just kind of dropped us into the middle of that story and expected us to sort of understand what the character drama was and care about everybody. And I don't play World of Warcraft, and maybe a lot of that was the fact that these are actual characters from the game that people who play the game were familiar with, and me, a peasant, was just not familiar with that. But peasant should be able to watch the movie and like it, and I didn't. Yeah. I walked away from that movie feeling like I was never given the proper time to care about any of that drama or care about any of the characters, save for like maybe two of the orcs. With this movie, the first time we see Leo exist in his space is this really, really cool scene where he's in his, because the I guess prologue to the movie is when you see him have the accident that causes him to lose his voice. You see, he was in a river, the edge of a boat, I guess the boat propeller like cut his throat. And there was this controversy with his family about, operating on him and being able to repair his voice box because they're Amish and they don't believe in they don't believe in using that kind of technology. And then the next thing we see of him, he's in this apartment, he's got these books, he's got these wood carvings, and it feels like it feels like it could be now, kind of like you see him kind of operating in this space, and then it's slowly in the background, these, you start to hear these weird droning noises and these weird lights, and you're like, wait a minute, where are we? And then finally you cut out and it's like, oh crap, we're in like Blade Runner right now. But he's still operating in this very traditional old-fashioned space. And like that, in just 2 minutes of like no dialogue, I understood this character's deal. I sympathized with him and I cared, just me personally.
Yeah, but like for me, the Blade Runner feel, the movie itself, and especially the new one, 2049, is ominous. The sounds cultivate a mystique and ominous. This is just monotonous. This is the drones and the visuals. They don't make me feel anything other than just tired and dull and confused and like I have a headache. And in terms of Leo, I just realized, first off, he has a restriction, a character restriction or a character challenge, which is his inability to speak. Beyond that, Duncan Jones gives him another restriction, which is to not use technology. How much more can you remove your main character from a very interesting world? Do you see where my problem lies with it? If you're going to make him mute, no, hold on. If you're going to make him mute, but it doesn't, the concept is interesting. You can't sustain it for 2 hours. If you're going to make him interesting in this world, make him utilize technology in a way that helps him overcome his restriction or his ability to find Nadira or operate in the world. And they kind of get into that very late in the story. It's just because here's where I come from it. Here's where I come at it. Just because it's conceptually interesting does not mean it can be sustained or integrated into a compelling narrative or a compelling film. And that's where this fails. That's where all these elements fail to coalesce for me.
I personally saw a lot of him grappling with the technological elements in the movie. I mean, I don't think it's not the movie. Like the movie itself is not about him learning to use technology. He is pretty sound in what he believes, and he's pretty sound in his own space. His problem is a very literal one. He's just trying to find his girlfriend, and he struggles to use the technology, and he struggles. Like there's this one great scene where he figures out that to track her phone, he can order this
Happy
drone
Meal to
delivery,
go. Yeah.
delivery meal, but he has to verbally say her address, and it's not. And the film doesn't stop necessarily to ponder the implications of this. It's simply an obstacle thrown in his path for him to overcome, and that is, again, that's a choice. Like, I think the choice in this movie wasn't necessarily to make it about the overcoming of the obstacles. It put the obstacles in there to make the story, to make it just harder for him as a character, to make getting from A to B more of a literally and physically complex journey for him, which makes for an engaging watch, because you're confident in his ability to persevere and push on, but you're also worried because you don't know if he's gonna run into something that he just doesn't know how to work, or something that he can't do because of his vocal impairments. But the story also does a good job too of letting those be assets. Like, there's this scene at the end, which we'll get into when we talk about the ending, where his problem, or his thing that he constantly has to do, ends up being an asset for him in defeating the uber bad guy and whatever. So one thing I will say, though, I'm sorry I'm going on a little long, but one thing I will say is I do agree, it's not Blade Runner or Blade Runner 2049 in terms of its visuals. Like, it is a pretty standard cyberpunk noir landscape that he's existing. And what's interesting about this movie is the characters. It's not necessarily I struggle to say world building, because world building is a lot more than just production design and cool gadgets and stuff. But at the same time, it's, like I said, this isn't a movie about the landscape. This isn't a movie about a future world. It's a movie about characters doing things that just so happens to be set in a futuristic world. So that this futuristic world is kind of nondescript, I personally didn't find that much of a problem.
I guess from a visual or a creative standpoint, it seemed to blend current with future very well. I gotta give it very high praise for how it integrated devices like the meal delivery, or the clubs, or the brothels, or the vehicles. It all felt very Berlin. It felt very, very European, very distinctly European. There was an absolute clear intention of how to set the story and tone, and something that is relatable yet totally foreign. So that's awesome. And there are little vignettes of him struggling or either struggling with his restriction or using his restriction to his advantage. And, or later on in the story, cultivating some kind of empathy where you see this passion, desire for him to find his missing girlfriend, but it almost feels like he can't fully connect to his goal because A, he doesn't use technology, and B, he can't speak, which finding someone in a super techno, futuristic cyberpunk landscape, you'd really want to be able to speak and use technology.
Yeah.
So that's all great. But again, it comes down to engagement. For example, there's a show that came out called Altered Carbon, which was a murder mystery kind of
on Netflix.
On Netflix. Yeah. Hey, the home experience. And it covered similar tonal territories. And yes, it's a little cheesy. It's a bit campy. There's a little less maturity, but it was so engaging. Even if it was campy, I stayed up for the greater part of 2 weeknights watching the entire season because I couldn't put it down. Like, I didn't care what the ramifications were the next day. I had to hone in on the story. Conversely, with Mute, I couldn't come back to my computer. I was struggling every night to come back. And even if I can't fully quantify it with film theory, like, they're both very visually similar and tonally similar and similar devices and world building, and one was insanely engaging. The other one was a chore.
Maybe what it is, and I haven't seen Altered Carbon yet, so I can't necessarily speak to it, but from what I've seen of Altered Carbon, it does feel like a lot more like something like Blade Runner, where it feels like you're on a different planet, whereas with Mute, you kind of touched on this in what you were saying, it doesn't feel too far off. Like, it's just removed enough, like, everything is just removed enough for it to be a sci-fi movie. Like, you've got rudimentary androids, you've got obviously the drone delivery service, smartphones are more advanced in this world, but it's all the kind of stuff where I watch it and I go, that could easily exist in 20 years. Like, Berlin could easily look like this in 20 years. I'm not saying that makes it less engaging, but it does make the world feel a lot less novel, if that makes sense. But again, for me though, that just personally made it more interesting. That in and of itself engaged me.
And this is this is one of the reasons that can bump this film a point up from the very bottom of a 0 rating, is simply because, like, I adore films where I feel like every decision the crew or the director made was towards a very specific, crystal clear goal. And I think if I drove down some roads, or I found some corner of the world, like, I could put on a few lights, decorate it and make it feel exactly like something from Mute. And that's something that I feel is so important for films like this, because again, it's very clear at this point, I'm not going to hold back. Like, I hated it, but to rate it, say it's a 0 or it's a disaster, is so disrespectful towards the sum of its parts. A film is not just its story. A film is not just its main character. A film is the lighting and the cinematography and the sound design and the sound mixing and the production design and the art decoration, So if I can separate an element and say, I loved the culture or the world that is presented to me, and I felt that even if I just digitally remove the characters, I want to look at this image and I want to feel what the people are feeling in this image. That's transportative, that's transcendent, and that's why we go to movies. So for that reason alone, I got to give high praise for, even if I have to look past the main story, I can just look at the background or look at the editing assembly and enjoy the very distinct appreciate even the very distinct presentation that is rooted in some kind of reality.
And you're 100% right, by the way. Duncan Jones does have a tie to Berlin. His dad, David Bowie, did the Berlin trilogy. It was the 3 albums that were sort of inspired by the time that he spent in West Berlin in the late 70s. So yeah, and I agree. I think that love and that interest in the vibe of the city is very present in this movie, and it's certainly one of its assets.
This was a very personal movie for Duncan Jones as well. His father, David Bowie, passed away as I think he was finishing revising or prepping this movie, and this is something he was very involved with his father in terms of his own creativity with movies. Like, I know his dad really supported his journey as a filmmaker. And again, Duncan Jones is not just an example of nepotism. Like, he's
talented.
What he does is so separate from what his dad does. They're two artists, but they could not be more different in a lot of how they go about things. Like I said, this movie took forever to get made. It started with an independent film called Moon, which was his directorial debut in 2009. And he was really working up the clout to be able to negotiate some kind of trust in him to execute his vision alone with this film. If he were to go through a major studio or release it theatrically and not through Netflix, I think a lot of the distinct elements would have been restrained. I mean, obviously, look, if I was in a room, I would say, God damn, make it more interesting. Like, make it faster, make it this, make it more flashy. And at the end of the day, we talk about this a lot. That's not always the best thing. Like, yes, the average person might have been more engaged, but I think I would rather what I consider failures like this that explore a different kind of narrative or story elements like Surgeons for the Mafia or a mute Amish bartender, like truly original characters and elements than just to have a run-of-the-mill cyberpunk action film.
So one of the things that I mentioned that this movie does do very differently is it intercuts its main narrative with this B narrative between Paul Rudd and Justin Theroux, who, like I said, play these surgeons working for the mafia. Paul Rudd, his character's name is Cactus Bill, is an American soldier who basically defected from the army and is now trying to get home with his daughter. And Justin Theroux, spoilers here, but he plays this doctor who's Bill's best friend, but is secretly a pedophile and is using his business to exploit young girls. This arc, I'm just gonna say personally, like this arc and this dynamic between these two very weird characters could have easily been a movie in and of itself. Their interplay with each other is so fascinating and disturbing, and their individual performances are so layered and complex, and their banter is so entertaining and fun to watch. I think my biggest quote unquote problem with the movie was it just almost didn't even belong in the movie. It was so good that it felt like it belonged in something completely different. But I want to know what your sort of opinion on that was.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I was going to bring that up as well. About 30 minutes into the film, these guys just show up. And the movie cuts away from Leo for so long because you think we're just going to have Leo in every scene. Leo, completely centric on the mute bartender, completely do a very deep and consistent and ongoing character study of how someone would handle the situation. All of a sudden, we have these giant sequences of scenes, of surgeries, of like dubious behavior on behalf of Justin Theroux, of character confrontations, betrayals. It is a different movie. I genuinely believe that if we just stuck with Leo and did put all in, if they just did all in, we're going to stick with this bartender 90% of the scenes. I feel like we would have gotten a whole kind of like Her. You've seen Her, right?
Yeah,
it's
Her,
so
yeah,
centric on Joaquin Phoenix, and there's an interesting premise where you have a guy with a digital girlfriend essentially who's gone through a breakup and is trying to engage in a weird part of a very near futuristic society. We have the same thing with Mute, except we cut away to a more interesting and different story to the point where I almost wonder if independently these two stories could have worked. Perhaps I actually think when they cut away from Leo, he was gaining traction. Like I was starting to care. I was starting to develop empathy and not sympathy. I was starting to get the flow and the tone and his character dynamics. And then all of a sudden we have to start act one or start scene one of a totally different futuristic thriller with two mafia surgeons, which have brilliant interplay and are great to watch, but are in almost a antagonistic juxtaposition to Leo's story.
I won't disagree with you about the antagonistic juxtaposition. I mean, the two stories do coalesce and they do meet each other, and when they first meet each other, I think it works, and then the movie proceeds to fly off the rails, but I'll get to that in a moment. I have a very big problem with this movie, which I will lay out. I won't disagree with you that it is jarring, that juxtaposition between the two narratives, but upon watching it a second time, I really felt, and this is coming from somebody who liked Leo as a character, like I liked him as a character and I liked his journey. I don't know if I would have spent an hour and 40 minutes with him. I mean, like his arc is so simple and his journey is so straightforward, and Alexander Skarsgård's performance is so excellent, but I feel like to give him the movie entirely would have stretched that all a little thin. Again, like we'll never know because that is not the movie we got, but I think a lot of the impetus behind making the Cactus Bill arc a large presence in the movie was maybe that it just would have, I mean, it's kind of ironic that I'm saying this because I know you found it really dry, but the movie would have ended up really dry if it were just about Leo. It was just something that I picked up on that I thought might have been a reason for that decision, because it was obviously a decision, but I could be wrong.
I'll tell you, for most of the movie, you're wondering, why do we have so much of these
Why
characters?
are we watching this? Yeah, like,
the end reveal, which spoilers here, is that Cactus had a baby with Nadira, who is Leo's girlfriend currently. He ends up killing her for whatever reason, probably because he's a complete freaking psychopath in the entire movie who does violent things for no reason. So you understand, when you go back, you see all these plants that Nadira is talking about Cactus, but you don't know it yet. Or Cactus is talking about Nadira or Leo, and you don't know it yet. So it is a slow burn, slow reveal mystery thriller. It's just so confusing until the last act. The majority of the middle act is inherently interesting, just completely confusing.
Well, and something else that kind of piggybacking off of that now that we know what the ending is, now that we know, oh, Cactus is the murderer, it's really jarring emotionally as a audience member because the rest of the movie has played largely as a two-hander. Cactus feels like a protagonist in his own right. He's somebody who we understand his struggle. We empathize with his struggle. Paul Rudd is insanely charming in the lead role, but so that when we learn that he is the bad guy of this story, it's very jarring. It's very uncomfortable. You sort of have to like rethink everything that you just watched, and that's not a very kind thing to do to an audience member, whether it's a good decision or not. Like I watched this movie with my sister, and she didn't like it, obviously, but her reason for not liking it was that she was like, look, I've been spending the last hour and a half with this guy. I kind of like this guy. He's the murderer? Like, really? Like, and then she asked, like, well, then why did you make me spend all of this time with him? And it was one of those things where I kind of appreciated that just personally, because I feel like how we present violent people in movies is so binary. Like, if you're a bad guy, or if you're a violent person and you commit horrendous acts of violence against women, you're terrible and you're evil and you wear a hoodie and sneak around in alleys. And what's so honest I felt about this movie was that, no, Cactus is a person. Like, you know, he's a person with struggles and flaws, and he's also a misogynistic murderer, and that's a hard hurdle to overcome mentally. But that's a hurdle that we as a society have to overcome, because a lot of times people who are this violent do generate this much sympathy. That was kind of I don't know what was going on in Duncan Jones's mind when he structured this and when he chose to present the movie to us in this format, but that would be my theory.
So here's the thing. I get that it's subversive or different or even realistic, but to what end? It's interesting, but why? What theme or what character revelation or what mood does it achieve besides confusion? You see what I mean? Like, any movie can do whatever it wants as long as it is purposeful, and not just purposeful because, oh, it might be interesting. It's purposeful because it needs to attach to some kind of theme or intellectual understanding of these characters. Did Mute do that at all, is my question.
I think, and this is where I come back to my previous problem, I think that was very much a theme of that specific arc. Like, on its own, the Cactus Duck section of the movie has this very strong effect and this very strong thematic underpinning, but that's also but what it is it's a very different thematic underpinning than all of the Leo stuff. So even when the two stories coalesce, even when the two stories finally meet, they're meeting in a literal sense. They're meeting in the sense that, oh, now we know that Cactus is the bad guy. Now we know what our the next stage of our protagonist's journey is going to be. But they don't meet in a thematic sense. The movie is still operating somewhat on two different thematic tracts, and proceeds to operate on those two different thematic tracts until the ending.
Sure. The movie demands a real blind investment in the 2-hour story, specifically because it's so convoluted in the middle act. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, you need to sit in this chair until the credits or you're not going to understand what's going on. It requires a certain dedication. Yeah, it's not something you watch on a Wednesday night with your partner just for fun. It's like it's almost like a movie that's really made for film lovers because of what it does with the medium and the storytelling. And that's probably why it was a passion project of a very artistically raised individual, someone who grew around with David Bowie as their dad and has this real weird appreciation for cinema and character and story. It is specifically designed, even in its subversion and its convoluted portrayal of what could be a very trite story. You know, you don't come away from this movie and say, oh yeah, it's the same thing where a guy who's down and out of his luck has his girlfriend disappear for this, that. Like, in some ways, the film could have gone horribly wrong in such a bland sense. And it shot for the stars and missed, but at least it shot for the stars.
So when it's all said and done, you know, how did this movie come together for you? Like, what would you give this movie in terms of a rating?
So yeah, for the final verdict, I guess as we can call it, it hurts because I never like to put down good filmmakers or people I like or people who try hard, but I have to settle on thoroughly on a thumbs down rating. So I'll give it a 2 out of 5, just specifically the 2 being for its proficiency in cultivating a feel and a design, but overall really, really rough. But what about you? I want to hear, I know this vibed with you a bit better, so I want to hear what your rating was and also kind of some of the elements that bring you to that final conclusion.
Well, yeah, see, it's like I have a 2 stars, but it's the 2 stars that I took off. I'm at a 3 out of 5 stars in this movie, but the 2 stars for me are the ending.
The 2 stars you took off, or the 2 stars?
The 2 stars I took off really are just for the ending, which I think was the only decision on Duncan Jones's part that I found really poor. Basically, Justin Theroux's character kills Cactus and then takes Leo on a road trip where he gives him a voice box and demands that he apologize for killing his friend. And it's this part of the movie where I won't get into too much detail because I do want to say I recommend that all of you listening do go and watch this, but you'll experience this when you watch the movie. All the character and all the interesting thematic work that was done over the last 2 hours gets thrown out the window so that, you know, Duck can give Leo a voice box. And the reason he gives him a voice box is for this payoff at the ending where basically he's about to throw Leo off a bridge. Again, none of this makes any sense. And Leo does this thing because every time he has to drink, right? Because of the way his throat's cut up, every time he has to drink, he has to like hold his breath and drink. So he like grips onto Justin Theroux and like holds his breath and drowns him and jumps into the river and drowns him. And it's this cool thing where it's like, oh, it's a payoff because, oh, he's using his disability to save the day and whatever, and that's all fine and well. But then the little girl who he now knows is his girlfriend's daughter is about to like fall off the bridge, and he's got to like scream up to her, like saying like, no, stay back. And it's one of those things where you can tell Duncan Jones was like, oh, get it, because now he's gone through this journey and he finally has the ability to speak, and he needs to use his ability to speak. Like, he needs to evolve, he needs to change. But then why did you have the guy give him the voice box? Like, it felt like such a weird plot development that just didn't work in the context of the movie. It felt like all of a sudden now the plot was being dictated by the theme. The plot was being dictated by what the director needed to have happen 10 minutes on down the road. And it felt like, honestly, a betrayal of the rest of the movie, which felt very loose and very casual and scattered, sure, but scattered in a way that I personally felt engaging.
Well, it lost its authenticity in the end. It stopped feeling like a story with real characters and started feeling like someone was telling everywhere what to stand and what to do, and you go here and this goes here, and I guess I can use this to tie up that. And it's a real weird twist. I didn't even think of the ending much when I picked the rating or when I'm
really
concluding it. I mean, it's interesting that you like the first part so much because I was already thoroughly checked out by the time we got to the last act. And then the last act doesn't really help. It would have been a script that I think could have gone through a few more revisions. I know he worked on it for so long, and it's kind of a little concerning that this is the project that he had full creative control on and was able to edit for 10 years and rewrite for 10 years. It feels shockingly like a second draft of an original story that was conceived 6 months before it was shot. It needed the finesse or the guidance of someone who wasn't Duncan Jones to iron out some of the real grotesque betrayals of tone or character. And I think it could have reached a real potential if it did have some more help creatively.
Yeah, and see, for me, it's like that's literally it. Like that would have been my only, quite frankly, that would have been my only note on the script. Like I really like the script, and I think if I were to read it and, before it went into production and talk to Duncan Jones, I would say, like, look, yeah, people are not going to get this thing. People are going to not be on board with it, but let your freak flag fly. Like, let it be weird, and let there be this dissonance between the arcs, whatever. That clearly is what you want to do, but take out the giving of the voice box. Take out the giving of the voice box at the end, because what you're doing is you're kind of like, you're kind of betraying your own internal logic. And that's where it runs into a problem for me. And that's why I unfortunately can't give it the 5-star rating that I so desperately want it to, is because, like, I left the movie frustrated because I felt like those last 10 minutes really betrayed the 2 hours that came before.
Next week, we're going to be discussing a small movie that's perhaps a bit more conventional, albeit very creative and distinct, called The Kings of Summer. It was an indie drama that came out 5 years ago, and it launched the career of Jordan Vogt Roberts, who went on to do Kong Skull Island, and he's going to do a Metal Gear Solid movie, a video game movie. It's really good, and I can't wait to sink our teeth into it because it is so uniquely crafted. I struggle to compare it to another film, even though it falls into a very trite, broad umbrella of coming of age. It shines in an overcrowded genre.
Yeah, I'm excited. I actually haven't seen it yet, and I've heard really good things about it. This is of course an instance where a director going off on their own to try something new and different yielded a very positive result. Obviously, the movie was very well received, and Jordan Vogt Roberts was given the helm to the King Kong franchise, which, talk about a big franchise. And I did see Kong Skull Island, and I really liked it. So I'm actually really excited to see this one. Yeah.
And super excited to continue to examine some movies that aren't on the radar. I mean, it could have been very easy to miss Mute or Kings of Summer or some other movies that we're going to have in our future that we're kind of putting together a list for. I'm just very excited to kind of corral our discussion into common themes that week to week we can say reference past movies and look ahead to future movies. And I think it strikes true for us as film students or aspiring filmmakers to examine these things and ask these questions, even though they're a little weirder. It feels good to be able to put ourselves out there in a commentary sense, not just with narrative film, to be able to say, like, this is how we feel and we're just going to say it. And like this week we disagreed. I mean, it's not the end of the world. It was thankfully far less emotional than our fights over Last Jedi. So look for our podcast for The Kings of Summer in the near future. And also be sure to check out some of our other videos on the Screen Fever channel. We have a lot of discussions that aren't exactly podcast friendly, but that we're excited to broadcast, and also some other content like video essays and short films that'll be coming your way soon. Anyways, I'm Adam.
I'm Jackson.
And we'll see you next time.